The sound of the gavel cracked through the courtroom like thunder. Bang, bang. Judge Aileen Cannon leaned forward, her voice sharp and commanding. Order! Silence in my courtroom. For a moment, the room froze. The marble walls seemed to vibrate with the echo of authority, and all eyes shifted to Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, seated with a calm but fiery resolve written across her face. Narrators call this a moment of truth, and that's exactly what it was. A federal judge, cloaked in power and draped in the robes of authority, was attempting to silence one of the most unflinching voices in American politics. Spectators leaned in, reporters clutched their pens a little tighter, and cameras whirred to capture every micro-expression. You could feel the electricity, the clash of arrogance against dignity, power against principle. Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't look down, didn't shrink back into the silence the judge demanded. Instead, she held her ground with a steadiness that seemed to rattle the very foundation of the courtroom. Behind her, a row of supporters sat motionless, their breath caught in their throats, waiting to see how she would respond. The judge, impatient, banged the gavel again. The sound was meant to intimidate, to remind everyone in the room that she ruled here, but what unfolded next would expose just how fragile that illusion of control really was. Reporters glanced at each other, exchanging knowing looks. Something big was about to happen. You could practically hear the unspoken question hanging in the air. Would Jasmine back down or would she rise? And then, in a voice steady as steel, Jasmine Crockett lifted her head and began to speak. Her words, though calm, carried a weight that seemed to silence even the gavel itself. The audience could feel it. This wasn't just another courtroom clash. This was a confrontation between truth and pretense, between a woman who carried the voices of her community and a judge trying to mute them. Every second stretched out like an eternity. Phones buzzed under desks as aides texted updates. Tweets began to ripple through the digital sphere, and yet in that hushed chamber, it felt as though time itself was holding its breath, because what Jasmine Crockett was about to say wouldn't just shock the judge. It would shock the entire country, but no one was prepared for what Jasmine Crockett would do next. To understand the firestorm that erupted in that courtroom, you first have to understand who Judge Aileen Cannon is, and why her very presence behind the bench stirs controversy across the country. Appointed by Donald Trump during the waning days of his presidency, Cannon's rulings have often raised eyebrows, sometimes even sparking outrage. Critics argue she has bent the scales of justice in ways that seem less about the law and more about loyalty. From decisions that slowed down investigations into Trump's classified documents to rulings that many legal scholars called unprecedented, Cannon has been no stranger to headlines. To her supporters, she's a defender of conservative principles. To her detractors, she's a judge whose gavel often tilts toward the powerful rather than the people. That's what made the clash with Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett so electric. Crockett, unlike many who passed through Cannon's courtroom, was not a quiet defendant or a meek attorney hoping to curry favor. She came armed with something far more threatening to unchecked authority: the truth and the fearlessness to speak it. Jasmine Crockett's reputation preceded her. A freshman member of Congress from Texas, she'd already made waves for her unflinching style. Sharp questioning in committee hearings, fearless speeches on the House floor, and a knack for slicing through political doublespeak with surgical precision. She wasn't one to be intimidated by titles or robes. Where others saw walls of power, Crockett saw opportunities to tear them down brick by brick. And on that day, facing a judge whose rulings had already been accused of undermining democracy itself, Crockett embodied the role of truth-teller in a room desperately in need of honesty. But this wasn't just about one exchange between a judge and a congresswoman. The stakes ran deeper, into the heart of what America claims to stand for. Was the courtroom a place where truth could thrive? Or would it become just another stage for political theater, where the powerful silence dissent and ordinary people are left voiceless? As Judge Cannon wielded her gavel, demanding silence, the symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. This wasn't only about courtroom decorum. It was about who gets to speak, who gets to be heard, and who gets shut down. And Crockett knew it. Every time she opened her mouth in defiance of silence, she wasn't just speaking for herself. She was speaking for every community that has ever been told to sit down, stay quiet, and let the adults in power make the rules. The tension rose as spectators whispered and reporters scribbled notes. The air was thick with the knowledge that this was no ordinary clash. This was a battle over democracy's most fragile promise, accountability. If Cannon could silence Crockett here, in plain view of the press and the public, what message would that send to millions watching across the country? That truth is negotiable, that authority trumps justice? But Crockett wasn't about to let that narrative stand. She leaned forward, her eyes locked on the bench, and her very posture made clear that she was ready to raise the stakes. She wasn't there to perform for headlines. She was there to confront arrogance with dignity, to remind the room that no one, judge or otherwise, was above answering to the truth. And just as Cannon believed she had reasserted her control, Crockett delivered a response that cut deeper than anyone expected, because when Cannon thought she could flex her power unchecked, Crockett raised the stakes higher. To truly grasp the gravity of this confrontation, you have to look beyond the gavel in Judge Aileen Cannon's hand and study the path that placed her on that bench. On paper, she carries the dignity of federal office, a Trump-appointed judge robed in the authority of lifetime tenure, entrusted with guarding the Constitution. But paper credentials can mask cracks in the foundation, and in Cannon's case, those cracks have grown into chasms that legal scholars across the country have been shouting about. Her record reads like a case study in how power can be bent to serve the few instead of the many. From the moment she intervened in the high-profile investigation into Donald Trump's mishandling of classified documents, Cannon seemed determined to shield the man who had appointed her. Legal experts called her rulings unprecedented, unmoored from precedent, and a gift to Trump's defense. In one notorious decision, she slowed down the entire investigation by appointing a so-called special master to review the seized materials, an act many described as an unnecessary delay tactic designed to benefit one man above the law. The 11th Circuit Court of Appeals struck down her decision in scathing terms, a rare rebuke for a sitting federal judge. But to Cannon, the criticism rolled off like rain on marble. She carried herself as if her authority was untouchable, as though being overturned by higher courts was little more than an inconvenience. That arrogance was not a one-off moment. Time and again, her rulings leaned toward protecting entrenched power and silencing those who dared challenge it. In her courtroom, prosecutors found themselves constrained, whistleblowers dismissed, and ordinary citizens faced the towering shadow of a judge whose loyalty seemed less to the principle of justice than to the politics of power. It wasn't simply the legal community that noticed. Ordinary Americans began to wonder, how could justice survive if the guardians of the system themselves bent the rules? And yet Cannon appeared unshaken. She seemed to revel in the storm, speaking with the clipped precision of someone convinced her word was law in more ways than one. Even as commentators blasted her decisions, she projected an image of calm superiority. The robe became not just a uniform but a shield, one she believed made her untouchable. Her demeanor in the courtroom only amplified this image. Observers described her as cold, almost clinical, yet with flashes of disdain whenever someone pushed too hard against her authority. Lawyers who questioned her reasoning were met with curt interruptions. Witnesses who strayed from her narrow expectations felt the sting of her sharp rebukes. She was not a judge who encouraged dialogue. She was a judge who demanded obedience, and in that obedience she found power. But power built on intimidation carries its own rot. Each ruling, each display of arrogance, each moment she used the bench as a stage for control rather than justice chipped away at her credibility. Like a marble statue beginning to show cracks beneath the surface, Cannon's authority looked grand from a distance but fragile upon closer inspection. And those cracks were not lost on Jasmine Crockett. To Cannon, Crockett must have seemed like just another voice to silence, another critic to swat away with the gavel, another headline she could weather. After all, hadn't she already withstood the condemnation of appellate courts, the outrage of legal scholars, the scrutiny of the media? She had built a career on projecting confidence even when her rulings crumbled under review. Why would this moment be any different? That overconfidence is what made the clash so inevitable. Cannon believed she could humiliate Crockett in front of the room, diminish her presence, and send her packing with little more than a warning echoing in her ears. To Cannon, Crockett was not an equal player in the drama of justice. She was a disruptor to be controlled, a voice to be silenced. And it was in that certainty, that blind conviction, where Cannon revealed her greatest weakness. Because arrogance, history has shown us time and time again, always creates blind spots. It convinces the powerful they are untouchable, that the tide will never turn, that their grip on control can never be pried loose. But blind spots are dangerous things, especially when your opponent sees with clarity and courage, and Jasmine Crockett was about to find one. To understand why Jasmine Crockett's words carried such weight in that courtroom, you have to step back and look at where she came from. Because Crockett's fire wasn't forged in privilege or handed down through polished connections. It was carved out of the raw soil of Texas grit, raised on lessons that the world doesn't hand you respect. You fight for it. You earn it, and sometimes you demand it when others try to deny it. Born and raised in Dallas, Crockett's childhood wasn't one of easy comfort. She saw firsthand what working families endured, long hours for too little pay, communities neglected by those in power, and justice that often seemed to favor the wealthy and well-connected. Those early lessons became her compass. She wasn't the child who dreamed of climbing ivory towers. She was the one who looked around at her neighbors and thought, someone needs to fight for them. That calling led her to law school, a path not smoothed by privilege, but paved by relentless determination. While many of her peers pursued lucrative corporate law gigs, Crockett chose a different route. Defense attorney, standing beside those society was eager to discard. She represented the overlooked, the accused, the voices that rarely carried weight in marble courtrooms. She didn't just learn the law. She wielded it like a shield, proving time and again that even the most marginalized deserved a fair shot. And she did it with a style that was unmistakably her own. Crockett wasn't the kind of attorney who softened her words to please judges or appease opposing counsel. She was direct, fiery, unafraid to say what others tiptoed around. That boldness earned her both respect and resistance. Some colleagues whispered that she was too much, too loud, too confrontational, too unwilling to play the game the way it had always been played. But for the people she represented, those very qualities made her indispensable. Her transition into politics was almost inevitable. Texas, with its sharp divides and high-stakes battles, needed leaders who were willing to throw punches, verbally, legislatively, and unapologetically, for the communities often left behind. Crockett answered that call, first in the Texas House of Representatives, then in the halls of Congress. She carried her courtroom tenacity into the political arena, and the moment she arrived, she stood out. Unlike so many polished politicians, Crockett didn't filter her words into the bland, rehearsed sound bites that dominated Capitol Hill. She spoke with the cadence of someone who had lived the struggles she was describing. When she talked about inequality, it wasn't theoretical, it was personal. When she spoke on justice reform, it wasn't abstract. It was built on years of looking defendants in the eye and knowing the system was stacked against them. That authenticity made her a lightning rod. Critics scoffed at her bluntness. Supporters adored her for it. Every debate, every hearing, every floor speech added layers to her reputation. The congresswoman who wouldn't back down, who wouldn't let arrogance or hypocrisy go unchecked. She carried herself with a kind of righteous defiance, less about personal ego, more about representing the people who had placed their faith in her. And behind the fire was a deep well of empathy. Crockett knew struggle. She knew what it meant to be underestimated, to have doors closed before you even knocked. That made her victories sweeter, but it also made her battles more personal. But with that authenticity came risk. In the male-dominated arenas of both law and politics, a woman who speaks plainly and fiercely is often branded angry, unprofessional, or out of control. Crockett bore those labels more than once. But instead of shrinking, she embraced them. If standing up for my people makes me angry, then so be it. If refusing to bow to power makes me unprofessional, I'll wear it proudly. Every insult hurled her way only seemed to sharpen her resolve. By the time she walked into that courtroom where Judge Cannon presided, Jasmine Crockett was not simply a politician, not simply an attorney. She was a voice honed by years of struggle, sharpened by injustice, and fueled by a promise to herself. Never let anyone in power silence the truth. She knew the weight of gavel and robe, the authority Cannon wielded. But she also knew the power of words delivered without fear. And here's the truth. Everything in Crockett's life had prepared her for that exact moment. From the Dallas neighborhoods that taught her resilience, to the courtrooms that tested her resolve, to the congressional chambers where her voice rang out against corruption. Every step of her journey led to this clash. So when Judge Cannon tried to shut her down, Crockett didn't flinch. She fought back. The air inside the courtroom was already tense, thick with the kind of silence that follows an unexpected confrontation. Judge Aileen Cannon, cloaked in authority and armed with the gavel, leaned forward, her voice cutting through the room with sharp precision. "Congresswoman Crockett, you will confine yourself to the narrow issues at hand," she ordered, her tone dripping with condescension. The words weren't just an instruction, they were a dismissal, a deliberate attempt to put Crockett in her place. Crockett didn't flinch. Sitting tall, her eyes locked on Cannon, she radiated the kind of composure that unnerves opponents more than any outburst ever could. She didn't fold her hands meekly or avert her gaze. Instead, she adjusted the microphone ever so slightly as if to signal, "I'm not going anywhere." The judge tried again, sharper this time. "This is not a political stage. This is my courtroom. You will not grandstand here." A ripple passed through the audience. Reporters shifted in their seats. Spectators exchanged wary glances. It was the kind of moment where everyone braced for retreat, where most would have backed down to avoid contempt. But Crockett wasn't most people. She leaned forward, her voice steady, carrying both calm and fire. "With all due respect, Your Honor," she began, "truth is not grandstanding, and accountability does not stop at the courtroom door." Gasps echoed softly across the gallery. Cannon's eyes narrowed. "Congresswoman, you are out of line." The gavel struck once, sharp and final, a sound meant to silence. Crockett, however, remained unshaken. She folded her hands deliberately, almost leisurely, and waited for the reverberation of the gavel to fade. Then she spoke lower but clearer, forcing every ear in the room to strain toward her words. "Out of line," she said, "is when those entrusted with justice use it to shield power instead of serve the people. I am very much in line with the oath I took." The weight of her words shifted the atmosphere. It wasn't just a clash of authority versus defiance anymore. It was a duel between two visions of justice. Cannon's robe might have symbolized control, but Crockett's voice symbolized courage, and the contrast was electric. The judge bristled, visibly rattled. She cut in again, her voice rising. "This is my courtroom, and I will not tolerate disruption." For a fleeting second, the room held its breath, waiting to see if Crockett would finally yield. But instead, her posture became even more deliberate, her eyes unblinking. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't shout. She spoke with the kind of measured conviction that slices deeper than volume ever could. "Judge Cannon," she said evenly, "with all due respect, this courtroom does not belong to you. It belongs to the people. And I will not let truth be silenced simply because it makes those in power uncomfortable." The audience erupted in murmurs, some nodding, others stunned that anyone would speak so directly to a federal judge. Cannon banged the gavel again, her composure slipping. But the louder the gavel fell, the steadier Crockett became. Would Crockett back down? The narrator's voice echoed in the minds of all watching. Would she fold under the weight of authority, or seize the moment history had placed in front of her? Judge Cannon leaned back, clearly expecting her title and position to end the exchange. But Crockett leaned in, her voice carrying the sharp edge of inevitability. She wasn't there to grandstand. She was there to expose, to confront, to demand that the law serve the people and not protect the powerful. And then it came. Her reply so devastating, so precise, that the entire courtroom froze. For one breathless instant, it was as though time itself had paused. Even the judge's gavel seemed powerless against what had just been unleashed. The courtroom fell into stunned silence. The gavel cracked like a gunshot. Judge Cannon's voice, clipped and rising with irritation, reverberated through the courtroom. "Order, I demand order," she declared, her robe stiffening as if the fabric itself was straining to keep her authority intact. But Jasmine Crockett didn't so much as blink. Her calm was a sharp contrast to Cannon's unraveling composure. She let the echo of the gavel fade into silence, her eyes never leaving the judge's. That silence itself became a weapon, an unnerving pause that made every ear in the room lean closer, waiting, anticipating. And then, with the clarity of a seasoned attorney and the conviction of a woman carrying generations of struggle on her shoulders, Crockett began her counterattack. "Your Honor," she said, her voice measured but firm, This courtroom does not exist to shield the powerful. It exists to serve the truth. And if you attempt to silence me, you are not silencing Jasmine Crockett. You are silencing the very people this institution is meant to protect. Murmurs spread like wildfire through the gallery. Reporters' pens scratched furiously across notebooks. Cannon shifted in her seat, her jaw tightening, but Crockett pressed on, her rhythm deliberate, her words surgical. You accuse me of grandstanding, Crockett continued, leaning forward slightly. But let's be clear. It is not grandstanding to demand accountability from those who hold the reins of justice. It is not grandstanding to remind this court that no one, not a president, not an appointee, not even a judge, is above the law. The gavel struck again, but this time it sounded less like authority and more like desperation. Cannon's face flushed with heat, her voice shaking as she snapped. You are dangerously close to contempt, Congresswoman. Crockett didn't flinch. Instead, she paused, letting Cannon's words hang in the air like smoke, toxic and suffocating. Then she cut through it with razor clarity. Contempt? Crockett echoed, her tone steady. I have nothing but contempt. For injustice, for corruption, for systems that protect the powerful while punishing the powerless. But for the law itself, Your Honor, for the Constitution that guides us all, I have the deepest respect. That is why I cannot and will not remain silent. A gasp rippled across the room. Cannon's eyes darted toward the gallery, realizing she was losing not just control of Crockett but of the entire theater of perception. Spectators leaned forward, captivated by the rare sight of power being confronted so directly. Crockett pressed her advantage. She cited chapter and verse, drawing on her years as an attorney. Precedent is clear. The First Amendment does not stop at the courthouse door, nor does accountability. Judges are not immune to criticism, and silence is not the price of decorum when truth itself is under attack. Marbury v. Madison taught us that it is the province of the judiciary to say what the law is, but it is the duty of the people to ensure that law serves them, and not the other way around. The audience murmured again, louder now. Even some of Cannon's clerks exchanged nervous glances. For the first time, the cracks in Cannon's armor were visible. She shifted in her chair, her gavel hand trembling ever so slightly. Crockett didn't stop there. She drove the blade deeper, not with anger but with precision. You may wear the robe, Judge Cannon. You may wield the gavel, but neither the robe nor the gavel grants you the right to silence truth. Because the authority of this bench comes not from intimidation but from legitimacy, and legitimacy is lost the moment justice bends to shield the powerful. Her words hung in the air, heavy as stone. The judge opened her mouth to interject, but Crockett anticipated it. She raised a hand slightly, not in disrespect but as if holding the room in the palm of her hand. And let us not forget, she continued, her voice rising just enough to resonate across every corner of the chamber, that the people are watching. They see what happens in rooms like this. They see when power is abused. They see when truth is smothered. And they will not forget. At that moment, it wasn't just Crockett speaking. It was every voice that had ever been ignored, every truth ever dismissed, every fight for dignity and justice that had been shut down by arrogance cloaked in authority. Judge Cannon's lips tightened into a thin line, her face pale now instead of flushed. The gavel rested on the desk, unmoving. For the first time, she seemed unsure of herself. Crockett delivered the final blow, her words sharp and unforgettable. Silence may be the tool of the powerful, Your Honor, but truth is the weapon of the people, and no gavel can silence that. The courtroom froze. Reporters glanced at one another, wide-eyed. Spectators leaned back, stunned into silence. Even Cannon, the woman who had strutted into this moment so certain of her authority, sat motionless, her face betraying the shock of being publicly dismantled. It was a mic drop moment, the kind that echoed far beyond 4 courtroom walls, and Crockett knew it. She didn't smirk, didn't gloat. She simply leaned back in her chair, her composure unshaken, her presence radiating calm power. The silence that followed was deafening. It wasn't the silence Cannon had demanded with her gavel. It was the silence of realization, of a room watching arrogance collapse under the weight of truth. And as the shockwave settled, one truth became clear. Jasmine Crockett had not just survived Judge Cannon's attempt to silence her. She had turned the tables, exposing the frailty of arrogance when confronted with conviction. But the impact of this moment didn't end in the courtroom. It rippled across the nation. The silence inside the courtroom had barely faded before the outside world erupted. Reporters, still buzzing with adrenaline, sprinted from the gallery with phones already raised, speaking breathlessly into cameras. Within minutes, the first headlines hit the internet. Crockett stuns Judge Cannon with fiery counterattack, and courtroom gasps as Congresswoman confronts federal judge. What had begun as a tense hearing now exploded into a national spectacle. Clips of the exchange spread like wildfire. One shaky phone recording from the back row caught the moment Crockett declared, "Truth is the weapon of the people, and no gavel can silence that." In less than an hour, it had millions of views. Hashtags surged to the top of trending lists. Were truth over gavel, Crockett vs. Cannon, people power. Memes flooded social media. Some showed Cannon's face frozen in disbelief, side by side with Crockett's calm, unflinching stare. Others superimposed Crockett's words over iconic imagery. Civil rights marches, raised fists, scales of justice. The cultural reaction was immediate and electric. Progressive commentators hailed it as the courtroom moment of the decade. One viral tweet read, "Jasmine Crockett didn't just speak for herself. She spoke for every person who's ever been told to sit down and shut up." Celebrities amplified the message. Musicians, actors, even athletes shared the clip with captions like, "This is courage and accountability finally." But it wasn't just fans and influencers. Legal experts, usually cautious with words, couldn't ignore what had unfolded. Prominent scholars went on cable news dissecting every line. Judge Cannon's credibility has been under question for months, one said. But tonight, it isn't just legal scholars raising eyebrows, it's the American public demanding accountability. Another remarked, "Crockett did what many attorneys dream of. She pierced through the robe, through the gavel, and revealed the fragility of unchecked authority." Meanwhile, Judge Cannon's defenders scrambled. Conservative pundits accused Crockett of disrespect, calling the exchange an attack on judicial authority. But their outrage felt hollow against the tidal wave of support Crockett had ignited. For every critic calling her reckless, there were thousands praising her courage. The imbalance was clear. Cannon's side was shrinking, Crockett's was swelling. And then came the emotional validation, the part that mattered most to the people watching at home. In living rooms, dorms, cafes, immigrant households, working-class families, people felt seen. Messages poured into Crockett's office. "You spoke for me," one read. "You gave us a voice when no one else would." Another simply said, "Thank you for not backing down." What had seemed like just another courtroom skirmish had become something much larger. It was no longer about one judge or one hearing. It was about every battle where power tried to intimidate truth, every moment when authority leaned on silence as a weapon. Crockett's stand transformed into a movement of validation, pride, and resolve. Newsrooms noted the shift. Cable anchors spoke of a flashpoint moment in American democracy. Editorials framed it as a line in the sand between those who cling to power and those who demand accountability. One headline captured the mood perfectly. In Crockett's words, America found its voice. And as Cannon's credibility faltered, Crockett soared. Her speeches, her interviews, her social media posts were suddenly magnified by the weight of what she'd done. She wasn't just another lawmaker anymore. She was a symbol of defiance, of standing tall when told to kneel. But perhaps the most powerful reaction wasn't the noise online or the pundits debating on TV. It was the quiet resolve in communities across the nation. In classrooms, teachers replayed the clip to show students what it meant to stand firm. In union halls, workers cheered as they shared the video on projectors. In immigrant households, parents whispered to their children, "Look, that's what it means to speak truth to power." For once, people didn't just watch history unfold. They felt part of it. Crockett's victory wasn't hers alone, it was theirs. And that was the real shockwave. Yet as the applause swelled, Crockett herself stayed grounded. In her first public statement after the hearing, she didn't gloat. She didn't even mention Judge Cannon by name. Instead, she reframed the entire clash with humility and purpose. "This moment isn't about me," she said. "It's about us. It's about reminding every American that truth belongs to the people, not to those who try to silence it." And while the country was still buzzing, Crockett reframed the entire clash into a universal lesson. When Jasmine Crockett finally stepped out of the courthouse that evening, the cameras swarmed. The questions flew and the flashbulbs crackled like lightning. Yet in the middle of that frenzy, she wasn't triumphant in the way the headlines might suggest. She wasn't there to boast. She was there to anchor the moment in something larger than herself. With a steady voice, she looked straight into the sea of microphones and said, "This was never about me, and it was never just about one judge. This is about who we are as a nation, and who we refuse to become." Her words cut through the noise like a bell ringing clear. She framed the confrontation not as a clash of personalities, but as a lesson about democracy itself. Our system only survives when we remember that power belongs to the people, not to the robes, not to the gavels, not to the titles. Authority is only legitimate when it serves truth and justice. The crowd listening outside, activists, students, even ordinary citizens who had gathered just to witness history, erupted into applause. And the narrator's voice takes us deeper. Arrogance always collapses before integrity. Judge Cannon had every symbol of power, the bench, the gavel, the robe. But in the end, those symbols cracked under the weight of one unshakable fact. Truth cannot be ordered into silence. That was the lesson Crockett embodied. She continued, "I come from a community that knows what it feels like to be told we don't belong, to be told to sit down and be quiet. But silence has never brought us justice. Courage has, speaking out has, standing tall has. And today I did what so many before me taught me to do, refuse to bow when dignity is on the line." Her words transcended the courthouse steps. They reached every person watching at home who had ever been pushed aside, ignored, or belittled. The moment swelled into something larger. It wasn't just a personal victory. It was a collective affirmation. The message was clear. America is strongest not when arrogance rules, but when ordinary people claim their right to truth. Crockett reminded her audience that the arc of justice only bends when someone grabs hold and pulls. The narrator ties it back to history. In every generation, there are figures who stand up at the exact moment they are needed most. This was Crockett's moment, and her courage turned a courtroom skirmish into a symbol of hope. It echoed the same timeless principle, that integrity, once spoken aloud, can never be silenced again. And then she said the line that resonated across the nation. This was never about winning an argument in court. This was about proving that truth is bigger than fear, bigger than pride, and bigger than any single person's power. And that's a reminder we all need right now. Her words hung in the air not just as a statement, but as a call to dignity, a call to accountability, a call to remember that democracy is not something we inherit. It is something we protect with voices loud, clear, and unafraid, and it's a reminder we all need right now. So let's return to where it all began. The gavel, the order for silence, the attempt to humiliate Jasmine Crockett into submission. That single moment frozen in time could have ended with fear. It could have ended with yet another powerful figure flexing unchecked authority, but instead it ended with courage, with clarity, with a reply so sharp, so undeniable, that the arrogance on display shattered in front of the world. That's the lesson of this confrontation. Judge Aileen Cannon thought the robe would protect her. She thought intimidation could win. But Crockett proved what history has always shown us. Dignity silences corruption, and courage is louder than arrogance will ever be. And now the story is in your hands. If you believe that voices like Jasmine Crockett's matter, if you believe that standing tall against arrogance is what keeps democracy alive, then don't let this moment fade away. Share it, talk about it. Make sure no one forgets what happens when truth refuses to be silenced. Because here's the truth. Moments like these don't just live in courtrooms. They live in classrooms, in workplaces, in homes across the country, wherever ordinary people are asked to bow their heads when they know they should stand. And every time someone chooses courage, they carry the flame forward. So if you believe dignity will always outshine arrogance, share this story. Subscribe, join the movement, and together let's keep the truth alive. The screen fades to black, the echo of Crockett's words still ringing. Truth is bigger than fear. And with that, the story doesn't end. It only begins.